I think there are so few opportunities for us to hear enslaved people describe their lives. Every one of these ads tells a life story.
Slave breeding farms are among the darkest chapters in the history of slavery, hidden behind the veil of America's past. These farms were places where human beings were treated as mere commodities, their lives reduced to breeding machines. This horrific practice wasn't an isolated event. It was a widespread system that perpetuated the wealth and power of slave owners. With the birth of each new enslaved child, more wealth flowed into the hands of these barbaric figures. But how did it all begin? And why did it continue for so long? In the aftermath of slavery, these farms became buried secrets, and the stories of those who were subjected to them were silenced for generations. In this chapter, we reveal the shocking reality behind these breeding farms and the role they played in expanding the slavery trade. The practice of breeding enslaved people had economic motivations rooted in exploitation. Slaves weren't just seen as laborers, but as capital investments, with their reproduction ensuring the perpetuation of wealth. Slave owners often forced enslaved women into sexual relationships with men for the sole purpose of producing more slaves, ensuring a constant supply of labor. Many of these women were systematically raped, their pain and suffering serving as mere transactions in the eyes of their captors. Enslaved women were viewed through the same lens as livestock, their reproductive abilities being the most valuable asset they possessed. Yet, the emotional and physical toll this practice took on them was unimaginable, and the lives of their children were also determined by this grim fate. As the breeding farms expanded, so did the system of control. The practice wasn't just about procreation, it was about dominance. Enslaved individuals were seen as property, to be traded, bred, and worked to the point of death. And those who resisted, or who tried to escape this horrific fate, faced unimaginable consequences. The traumatic legacy of these breeding farms continues to haunt the descendants of those who were forced into this life. The generational trauma left behind is still felt today, with many still fighting for justice and recognition of the unspeakable horrors their ancestors endured. Despite the grotesque nature of slave breeding farms, they were protected by the law. Slave owners had the full backing of a system that saw their actions as justified. They were able to continue their reign of terror, unchallenged by any legal forces. And as we move through this chapter, we examine how this system of institutionalized abuse not only shaped the economy of the time, but also the very foundation of American society. The legacy of these breeding farms has long been a subject of denial and erasure, but the truth is undeniable. This was a dark chapter of American history that demands to be acknowledged and remembered. The shocking role of women in slave breeding. When we think of the horrors of slavery, we often focus on the men who were enslaved, forced to work in the fields and factories. But what about the women? Women were at the heart of the slave breeding industry, subjected to brutal exploitation in ways that few could have imagined. These women were seen not as human beings, but as tools for reproduction, their bodies controlled by those who saw them as nothing more than breeding vessels. In this chapter, we explore the disturbing truth behind the role of women in the slave breeding system and the horrific impact it had on their lives. Slave owners didn't just seek out women for breeding. They targeted those who were seen as breeders. These were women of childbearing age who were forced into intimate, non-consensual relationships with men in order to ensure the birth of more enslaved people. In many cases, these women were violently raped by slave masters or overseers. Some slave owners went so far as to establish breeding farms, where they carefully selected and paired enslaved individuals for reproduction. These women were often subjected to constant pregnancy, their children being sold into slavery the moment they were born. For these women, motherhood was not a source of joy. It was a means of survival, a brutal form of forced labor that came at a devastating cost. The mental and emotional trauma these women endured is impossible to fully comprehend. Forced to give birth to children who would be torn from their arms and sold away, they had no agency, no control over their bodies, and no rights. Their lives were defined by pain, humiliation, and the constant threat of violence. These women were often isolated, kept apart from their families, and were constantly surveilled to ensure they didn't resist or escape their captors. The effects of this psychological torment were felt for generations, as many of these women were forced to witness the brutal lives their children would lead under the same system of oppression. One of the most horrifying aspects of this system was the way it commodified the lives of these women. They were no longer seen as people, but as property, as tools for creating wealth. The brutal realities of forced reproduction weren't just about producing labor. They were about maintaining the power of slave owners. Slave owners sought to maximize their profits by manipulating the bodies of enslaved women, ensuring that the supply of slaves was constant and self-sustaining. And even after slavery was abolished, the scars left on these women and their descendants remained. The deep-rooted trauma they experienced continues to affect generations, long after the physical chains were broken. The dehumanizing auctions of slaves and their reproductive value slave auctions were a cornerstone of the brutal system of slavery, where human lives were reduced to commodities. These auctions were where men, women, and children were sold off to the highest bidder, separated from their families and forced into lives of grueling labor and suffering. But perhaps one of the most disturbing aspects of these auctions was the way in which enslaved people, particularly women, were sold for their reproductive value. In this chapter, we examine the dark reality behind slave auctions and the horrifying impact they had on the lives of the people involved. At these auctions, enslaved individuals were treated like cattle, paraded in front of potential buyers who would inspect them, often in the most degrading ways. Women, in particular, were subjected to an additional layer of scrutiny. Beyond their physical fitness, they were evaluated for their reproductive potential. This meant that enslaved women were valued based on their ability to bear children, and those who were deemed most capable of reproduction were sold for higher prices. The process of buying and selling human beings was an inhumane business, with no regard for the pain or suffering it caused. The auctions didn't just separate families, they commodified the very essence of human life. Parents were torn from their children, husbands from wives, and siblings from each other, all for the sake of profit. And for women, the trauma was compounded by the knowledge that their worth was tied to their ability to reproduce. This twisted system placed immense pressure on enslaved women to remain fertile, while simultaneously subjecting them to the horrors of forced reproduction. It wasn't just the physical pain of childbirth. They were forced to endure the psychological torment of knowing that their children would be sold into slavery the moment they were born. As we delve deeper into the reality of slave auctions, it becomes clear that these events were not only horrific, but foundational to the perpetuation of slavery itself. The buying and selling of enslaved people was a key part of the economic engine that drove the system, and the reproductive value of enslaved women played a crucial role in maintaining the flow of human capital. The trauma of these auctions didn't just affect those who were sold, it affected entire families, entire communities, and an entire culture. The scars of these events are still felt today, as the descendants of those who were sold continue to struggle with the legacy of slavery. In this chapter, we confront the uncomfortable truth that slavery wasn't just about labor. It was about exploiting human beings for their very ability to reproduce. The auctions, which were seen as business transactions, were actually acts of violence, ripping apart families and condemning individuals to lives of suffering. It's a painful truth, but one that must be acknowledged as part of the larger narrative of slavery in the United States. The horrors of forced family separations. Family separations were among the most brutal aspects of slavery, and they were particularly devastating for enslaved mothers and children. In this chapter, we dive deep into the heart-wrenching reality of how families were torn apart in the name of profit, and how the psychological damage of these separations continues to haunt descendants to this day. Enslaved families were treated as property, not as human beings with rights or relationships. This meant that at any moment, family members could be sold off to different slave owners, separated from each other forever. The trauma of being ripped from loved ones was something that enslaved people had to endure on a regular basis, and it created a sense of instability and fear that permeated every aspect of their lives. Enslaved parents had no control over their children's futures, and the heartbreak of seeing a child sold away was a pain that many carried with them for the rest of their lives. For enslaved women, the trauma of family separation was compounded by the constant threat of sexual exploitation. These women were forced into relationships with their masters or overseers, and their children were seen as nothing more than another way to generate profit. The notion of family in the context of slavery was a cruel illusion. An enslaved mother could never be certain that she would see her children grow up, as they could be sold away at any time. This destabilized the very concept of family, turning it into a source of constant anguish. But the emotional devastation of family separations wasn't just about the individuals involved. It also had lasting repercussions for the communities and cultures that were ripped apart. Enslaved people often had to rely on each other for support, forming tight-knit communities within the bonds of slavery. Yet even these relationships were often fraught with the fear of loss, as there was no guarantee that they would stay together. In this chapter, we look at how this constant upheaval not only fractured individual families, but also weakened the fabric of enslaved communities as a whole. The terrifying truth of sexual exploitation on slave breeding farms. The sexual exploitation of enslaved people was one of the most horrific aspects of the slave breeding system. In this chapter, we expose the disturbing realities of how enslaved women were subjected to repeated sexual violence and how their bodies were commodified for the benefit of slave owners. On slave breeding farms, sexual exploitation was not only a brutal violation of the enslaved women's rights, it was an essential part of the system that kept the farm profitable. These women were often forced into sexual relationships with the men who were bred specifically for this purpose. Slave owners would select these men based on their physical attributes, using them as stud horses to breed more slaves. These sexual assaults weren't just an individual crime. They were part of the larger structure of enslavement that dehumanized and brutalized an entire race of people. Enslaved women, many of whom had children, were often sold specifically because of their ability to reproduce. Slave owners would pair these women with the strongest, most physically capable men to create the next generation of slaves. These children, born into slavery, would then be sold as laborers, continuing the vicious cycle of forced reproduction. For these women, motherhood was not a source of joy. It was a tool of exploitation. The deadly price of enslaved labor slavery was at the heart of America's economy, especially in the South, where the brutal exploitation of enslaved people fueled industries like cotton, sugar, and tobacco. In this chapter, we explore how these crops were grown on the backs of enslaved people, and how the wealth generated from their labor perpetuated the system of slavery itself. The Southern economy was built on the backs of enslaved laborers, and crops like cotton, sugar, and tobacco became the lifeblood of this economy. Enslaved people worked from dawn to dusk, picking cotton in the scorching heat, harvesting sugarcane under the threat of violence, and cultivating tobacco for the benefit of wealthy plantation owners. These crops brought immense profits to slave owners, yet the enslaved people who grew them were left with nothing but hardship and suffering. The conditions under which enslaved people worked were brutal. Cotton picking in particular was backbreaking work. Enslaved people had to work long hours in the hot sun, with little rest, and were subjected to violent overseers who ensured that they kept working. The same was true for sugar and tobacco plantations, where enslaved people were subjected to grueling labor, often working 16-hour days with little to no breaks. This chapter reveals the terrifying truth about how these industries were built on the suffering of countless men, women, and children, and how the profits from their labor were used to fuel the growth of America. Yet, the legacy of these industries doesn't end with slavery. It continues today. Many of the businesses that profited from slave labor are still around, and their continued existence raises important questions about the ethical responsibilities of these companies and their role in perpetuating the system of slavery. In this chapter, we confront the uncomfortable reality of how the wealth generated by slavery continues to impact the world today. Forced reproductive labor. Slave breeding farms didn't just exploit the enslaved for manual labor. They also exploited them for their ability to reproduce. This systematic form of reproductive labor turned the bodies of enslaved women into a commodity. The idea of forced reproduction was a brutal attempt to perpetuate the cycle of slavery while simultaneously creating wealth for the enslavers. In this chapter, we uncover the disturbing truth of how enslaved women were used as breeding machines, and how their suffering echoed through generations. Enslaved women were often forced into sexual relationships with male slaves selected by their masters. These pairings were not romantic. They were calculated to produce strong offspring who could work in the fields or be sold for profit. Enslaved women were viewed solely for their ability to produce more slaves. These women had little to no control over their own lives, and their very purpose was reduced to childbearing. Slave owners would often disregard the emotional and physical toll this took, forcing these women to bear children repeatedly with no regard for their well-being. The children born from these unions would face the same fate: sold, worked to the bone, and treated as property. For the women subjected to this, pregnancy wasn't a time of joy or celebration. It was a period of exploitation. Many women had children who were taken from them at birth, sold away to different plantations, or separated from their families forever. These children were commodities, tools in the maintenance of the slave system, with no rights or freedoms. In this chapter, we explore how this practice not only dehumanized the women involved, but also reinforced the economic system of slavery by ensuring a constant supply of enslaved labor. The impact of this exploitation didn't stop at the women who were forced into these reproductive roles. It affected their children as well. Children born into slavery faced lives devoid of agency or control, their futures determined by the whims of their owners. The cruelty of this cycle was that it continued across generations, with each new birth representing both the perpetuation of slavery and the suffering of those born into it. These children often became part of the cycle of forced labor and sexual exploitation, with their lives predetermined before they even took their first breath. The exploitative nature of slave auctions. Slave auctions were the lifeblood of the American slave trade, a brutal and dehumanizing practice that turned human lives into property. But one of the most disturbing aspects of slave auctions was how enslaved individuals were sold for the highest bidder based on their physical attributes, abilities, and even their potential to breed more slaves. This chapter explores the gruesome reality behind these auctions, the exploitation involved, and the lasting effects they had on the enslaved people and their families. At these auctions, enslaved people were paraded in front of potential buyers, stripped of their dignity, and forced to endure humiliating inspections. The auctioneer would point out the physical qualities of each individual, assigning a monetary value to their body. The healthier and more physically capable the individual, the higher the price they would fetch. This process wasn't just about selling workers, it was about selling human lives for profit, and it laid the foundation for the continuation of the brutal system of slavery. One of the most appalling aspects of these auctions was the way in which families were torn apart. Mothers and fathers were sold to different buyers, never to see each other again. Children were separated from their parents, forced into a future of grueling labor and inhuman conditions. The emotional toll of these separations was devastating, and for the individuals involved, the pain of being sold was a lifelong trauma. These auctions weren't just financial transactions, they were deeply emotional, with long-lasting repercussions that carried on through generations. The practice of selling human beings like cattle was not just confined to the United States. Slave auctions took place all over the world, and the brutality and inhumanity were universal. What is most disturbing is how these auctions were normalized in society. They were viewed as a legitimate part of the economy, a vital practice that perpetuated the system of slavery. Even today, the legacy of these auctions continues to affect the descendants of the enslaved. The trauma of being bought and sold is something that has been passed down, a deep wound in the collective consciousness that has yet to be fully healed. The perpetuation of slavery through the commodification of human life. The idea that slavery was driven by a need for labor is only part of the story. What is even more disturbing is how the system of slavery was built on the commodification of human life, treating people as property that could be bought, sold, and traded like any other material object. In this chapter, we explore how the entire system of slavery was underpinned by this dehumanizing practice, where lives were assigned values based on physical attributes, and human beings were reduced to mere commodities. Enslaved people were stripped of their identities and treated as assets. They weren't viewed as individuals with emotions, histories, or dreams. Instead, their worth was determined by how much labor they could provide and, in the case of women, how many children they could bear. This view of people as nothing more than commodities extended to every aspect of their lives. Enslaved individuals were bought and sold as if they were tools or livestock, with no regard for their personal dignity or humanity. This commodification wasn't just about slavery, it was an integral part of the economic system that allowed slavery to thrive. The owners of enslaved people used them as investments, breeding more enslaved individuals in order to create more wealth. In fact, the very birth of enslaved children was seen as an economic asset, one that could be sold for a profit and put to work in the fields or factories. The enslaved women who were forced into breeding had their bodies reduced to tools of economic production, and their children became the next generation of laborers. The system of slavery didn't just affect the individuals who were enslaved. It affected the entire society that upheld it. The commodification of human life was ingrained in the fabric of the economy, with entire industries built upon the backs of enslaved people. The legacy of this exploitation can still be seen today in the economic disparities that persist in communities of color, where the effects of slavery are still being felt. This chapter takes a hard look at how slavery was not just about physical labor. It was about the financial exploitation of human beings, and how that exploitation continues to have ripple effects in modern society. The tragic cycle of forced labor and reproductive exploitation. The combination of forced labor and reproductive exploitation created a brutal cycle that enslaved people were trapped in, with no hope of escape. Enslaved individuals, particularly women, were subjected to years of grueling labor, while their bodies were repeatedly used to produce more slaves. This cycle of suffering and exploitation didn't just break individual lives, it tore apart families, communities, and entire generations. In this chapter, we explore the devastating impact of this vicious cycle and how it kept slavery alive for centuries. Slaves were not just forced to work. They were forced to work in some of the most horrific conditions imaginable. The labor on plantations, sugar mills, and cotton fields was backbreaking, with long hours in the heat and humidity. Many enslaved people were subjected to physical punishment if they didn't meet their quotas or if they tried to resist. But for women, the burden was even heavier. Not only were they expected to work in the fields, but they were also subjected to the repeated trauma of forced reproduction. These women were viewed as tools for creating more slaves, their bodies nothing more than instruments for profit. The psychological toll of this cycle of exploitation was immeasurable. Enslaved women often had no control over their own bodies, and their children were sold away before they even had a chance to bond with them. The emotional trauma of this forced separation created deep wounds that lasted long after slavery had ended. Many enslaved people died with these wounds still open, having never had the chance to live a life of freedom or dignity. Their lives were defined by forced labor, violence, and suffering, and their bodies were used as vessels for the perpetuation of a cruel system that valued them as nothing more than property. The cycle of forced labor and reproductive exploitation wasn't just about the physical suffering it caused. It was about breaking the spirit of those involved. This cycle was designed to crush hope, to make enslaved people feel like they were nothing more than objects to be used for labor. And when that wasn't enough, they were used to produce more of their kind. In this chapter, we reflect on the deep psychological damage caused by this system, which turned people into commodities and stripped them of their humanity. The legacy of this cycle continues to affect the descendants of enslaved people. The trauma caused by the brutal combination of forced labor and reproductive exploitation is passed down through generations, and the effects are still felt today. This chapter serves as a reminder that the impact of slavery didn't end with its abolition. It continues to shape the lives of those affected by it. We must confront the disturbing truths of the past so that we can honor the victims, educate future generations, and work toward healing. These stories are not just history. They are the foundation of our ongoing fight for justice, equality, and human dignity. If this story moved you, or if you want to learn more about the legacy of slavery and how it shapes our world today, we encourage you to leave a comment below and share your thoughts. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to stay informed, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more powerful content like this. Share this video with others so that we can continue the conversation and push for change.